Watching Direct Line with Ethan Gutmann, and our hosts are Mark Unkefer and Jackie Saxtein. Take it away, guys.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to Direct Line. Sorry for our tardiness. We had a little bit of a last-minute change of plans, although as far as you guys know, this was planned all along. So let's pretend that's going on here. I am joined, as usual, by Mark Unkefer, and we're joined with our guest tonight. Ethan, welcome back. I know you're a fan of the show, and you're a recurring guest of the show, so everyone knows who you are and what you're here about. So we're going to talk about China, right?
As always, I guess. But when was the last time I was on? I'm trying to figure this out because it wasn't that long ago, but it wasn't.
Maybe over the summer, right? Early summer.
Okay, that sounds right. Yeah. Okay.
So lots happened since you last.
I was a mess back then. I'm much better now. Thanks.
Get you at your best tonight. 10 out of 10.
So the last time you were on, we did talk about your book, and you've done really some great work in the past about the slaughter, about the treatment of Muslim Chinese. I kind of want to just give you an opportunity first to talk about that before I launch in a whole bunch of questions about the real estate market in China.
I'm not sure I can answer those questions about the real estate market. You know, I was talking to somebody recently who is in real estate, and they had a lot more to say about it than I do. That's a lot of what we're getting on that is somewhat speculative. I should warn people, but you know, and people have always saying, "Oh, this is the bubble. Now it's going to burst," and then it doesn't really burst. The Chinese are, let's not forget, this is China. These are sort of a nation of entrepreneurs who love, they love situations like this. They always find a way to make money in the worst situations known to man. Okay. But having said that, the Uyghur situation has really, and I don't say this lightly, but it has deteriorated even further to a great extent. I really feel that at this point, the Uyghurs, and it really isn't because they're Muslims, it really is because they're ethnically Caucasian, are hanging by a thread. Their survival is simply hanging by a thread. Now, I just was in the Uyghur Tribunal in London, and I testified there. All the best people testified there, everybody who's been doing this field. And it was astounding. Anybody who's looking for information on this, they can see it because we were all gathered in one place. And actually, a lot of us were actually in London for a change. It wasn't, I don't just mean remotely, we were gathered in one place. We were actually in London for this tribunal. And it was, I learned a lot. Having said that, we're also looking at a new phenomena, which I would love to talk about a bit, which is that the Uyghurs are being, the Uyghur diaspora is being retrieved and sent back to China. They're being deported from all over Central Asia. And now this, if this rings a bell, for me it does, because I'm half Jewish, and to me this is, it's so similar to what happened in Hungary. You know, Hungary was not part of the Axis. It was just a fellow traveler, really, with the Axis. But, you know, Nazis came in and said, you know, we'll solve this Jewish problem you have. We'll fix it for you. And they did. And they built a whole new camp next to Auschwitz to do so, to process those Jews. Now, they also said, we'll fix your Romani problem. You have these gypsies, we'll fix that too. Okay. And that's what we're looking at right now, all over Central Asia. And now in Afghanistan as well. There are 85 families, possibly 2,000 Uyghurs, who have settled down in Afghanistan for many years now. And they're going to be gone. There's no one there to protect them anymore. So that's not a huge number, but these are real people. They will disappear.
Absolutely. It's truly hard for me to think about. I'm Jewish. So, you know, just everything I've gone through with Holocaust education, it's, you know, we say never again, but not just never again to Jews. It should never happen to anybody. Is it purely a racism thing that's leading to these deportations? And it makes you wonder also, you know, in modern society, obviously we're very lucky to be in the US. Hopefully we would never see something like this in a free country like the US. How are these countries able to get away with doing that?
Well, I mean, they're under a lot of pressure from China. Obviously, it's mainly economic pressure, but it's real pressure. They're on their China's borders, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, to some lesser extent Uzbekistan, which is buffered, and Kazakhstan, and all of them are sharing borders. All of them are somewhat under Russian protection to some extent, but not fully. And the Chinese have launched the Belt and Road Initiative, and that is basically a receive money now and pay later kind of arrangement. And of course, these countries they're not very soluble. They don't have a lot of extra cash lying around. So they quickly get into trouble, and then China starts seizing land. And once it starts seizing land, the demand becomes insatiable because they see the possibilities of the land, which most Central Asian countries are not in a position to exploit. So the Pamir Mountains, for example, may contain more energy resources than anywhere else on Earth. We're just beginning to discover that now. We know it's got huge radiation deposits, vast amounts of yellow cake. These are the kinds of assets that China wants. This is the new South China Sea, essentially. And what they want to do is remove anyone who can get in the way of that. And obviously, every Uyghur today, not every Uyghur, but 50% of the Uyghurs out there have become kind of activists at this point. I mean, because of the situation, it's slowly unfolding genocide. So I would have to say that this is a terrible situation, and it's terrible for Central Asia too, because Uyghurs are one of the brothers of they're one of the family of the Central Asian nations. They're better entertainers than anybody else there. They're probably better entrepreneurs than any of the other Central Asians. They bring a lot to the table, and to get along, the Central Asian nations are now selling them out.
Are there any groups that are, we've seen this with what's happening in Afghanistan. We've seen groups going in independently of the government to get people out. Are we seeing anything similar in this situation where there are people who are going in independently to try and help the Uyghur population?
There may be. Now, there's an interesting bit of a rumor out there, which sort of says, well, actually, there were some Uyghurs who did get involved with ISIS and Al-Qaeda at different times. It's not a large group. It's a very small group. It was mainly young men who were recruited. They were told. It was kind of a Chinese operation, is the belief, that the Chinese would come in and say, we can give you a salary if you'll go out and pick up a gun and you can fight for your homeland. And then they'd promptly arrest most of them. But some Uyghurs escaped and did end up in Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Now, it's said that about 200 of them have entered Afghanistan. Now, that's not surprising. There are militants all over Afghanistan right now. It's crawling with them, right? It's militant central. It's Islamist central right now. The question is, are those Uyghurs there to defend the Uyghur population? Maybe. We don't know. The Uyghurs have never really fit into the Islamist paradigm. They've never really operated well within it. Their goal is very different. Their goal is to get independence from China. So I don't know. It's a very unclear situation, but I do think, no, are there people going into Tajikistan and getting them out like some of the Christians who just got out through Tajikistan? That was an amazing story. I don't know, but I doubt it. And I know that, just from knowing people in the Chinese Christian community, I know there's a lot of people trying to do that in Afghanistan right now. Probably not enough, but they're certainly trying. And I know that anyone who's been involved in Afghanistan in some form or another has the people pestering them every day going, help me, get me out of here. This breaks my heart watching this unfold.
Taking this kind of from a slightly different approach, one of the things that's going on, let's kind of go back to talk a little bit about China, is the effort on the part of Xi to consolidate power, to get a third term, which as the leader, there had been a protocol up to this point, at least for the last 30 years, I think it's fair to say, for there to be a rotation in leadership, I think it's fair to say, a desire not to go back to the sort of the extremes that had taken place prior to Deng Xiaoping. I'm trying to link the two and ask a question that ties that in, but much of this goes to sort of Xi's political consolidation. And would you think that's a fair connection to make?
I think it's a fair connection, don't you? I mean, it's this is part of the way you show power in China. In fact, a lot of the oppression of Falun Gong was irrational from most perspectives, and led them down a road where Falun Gong created a lot of trouble for the Chinese Communist Party over the years. They built media that nobody had ever seen a dissident group build media like that. You know, they built a dance troupe that's going around the world. They built culture. They built all these institutions. They built a publishing firm. Didn't go that well, but they did build one, and they built a newspaper, which eventually, after years and years, suddenly became very popular, right? During the Trump period. Now, are the Uyghurs causing problems for the Chinese Communist Party? Yes, very much so, right? That's it. And even, we're even starting to see some response from, say, United Arab Emirates and some other Muslim countries for the first time to the Uyghur plight. So I don't see this as rational, but I do see it as a form of power that the Chinese Communist Party has to, or whoever heads up the Chinese Communist Party has to, it's kind of like building the Great Wall. Every emperor's got to do it, right? And in this case, there's not really that many Falun Gong left to go after. But the Uyghurs are a lively population, an active population, yet small enough that it's easy enough to crush them as well. Now, so I do see it that way, but then it becomes one other question, which is always in my mind. How much of this is just simply about the cover-up? How much of this is you have created atrocities? They will be discovered. They are being discovered. What happens now? And I think if you look at Chinese Communist Party history long term, it's always about the cover-up. The Ukraine did not start. The starvation of the Ukraine didn't start as a starvation policy. It started as an attack on some kulaks, right? Some rich farmers to kind of make a point, or maybe gain some popularity, or perhaps was a very genuine expression of Marxism, what they perceived as Marxism. But over time, so many atrocities were committed that they had to end up starving half the population to death. All right. Just to make the point, like, shut up, don't talk about this. It never happened. So I think, the kinds of issues I look at, organ harvesting, for example.
Right.
It is a disaster for the Chinese state. And, for years, nobody really accepted that it was going on. Now it's becoming sort of commonplace to understand that it is going on, it has been for some time. Obviously, that interferes with Xi Jinping's plan to make pharmaceuticals a pillar industry. That's not going to happen anymore. That's gone. I mean, people have to go down to Hong Kong to get their, milk products for their children. People have to go to Hong Kong or somewhere else to get some Western medications. After the COVID thing, this is the end. The confidence game of pharmaceuticals is finished.
Absolutely.
So these are there are huge prices for these things. It's not always like China's so clever and there's so much rationality there, and this is a great strategy. These are not great strategies. They're really poor strategies in many ways, but they're essential for the internal operation of the Chinese Communist Party and making the point it needs to make to the Chinese people, not to you, to the Chinese people, right? We're in control here.
So with regards to, because you're talking about, well, a cover-up is usually what they're trying to go for here. But then I guess you just kind of answer my question by saying it's not about what they're trying to prove to the rest of the world. It's about saying that they're in control of the Chinese people. They're the ones they want to know, because in terms of covering things up, and we've seen this a little bit with the COVID origins, which again, they've very obviously been trying to cover up, but in the court of public opinion, they failed at that. But the Chinese only care that the Chinese people believe that. And with social media, it's harder for them to cover it up. I know that, I have some friends in China and it's more restricted there what they're able to see, but it only takes one whistleblower coming to the US and telling their story on Fox or CNN or what have you to really get a message out there that China can't control as soon as it hits the US or another country.
Well, I think they can control it better than, I see it a little differently. I think they're kind of masters of controlling it at this point. If you were to take a poll, now we can't take a poll right now. We can't even go into China, and say, I'm from a consumer agency, and I just want to find out if this average Chinese person is more likely to buy this television or this bag of rice this year. I can't even ask a question like that. It's too sensitive, all right? Let alone, how's Xi Jinping doing? I mean, we have no idea if the Chinese people would have him hanging from a lamppost within the next 15 minutes. We really have no clue. But similarly, we have no clue as to whether they really think that this was an American military operation. COVID-19 was sort of spread early on, with this combined, I forget what it was, a sort of a conference, combined forces, sort of a goodwill conference where everybody came over. And some Americans came over, American soldiers came over too, and they say, aha, you see, that's when it all happened. Mm-hmm. That's when they spread it in here. So, apparently, a lot of Chinese people believe that theory.
It's crazy to think about. I mean, living in the world that we do with the internet that we have, that even something as simple as a Google search is that they're able to restrict that. It seems like we have all the information we need at our fingertips, and the fact that you could live in a country that you would think has the same the World Wide Web, not the world minus China Wide Web, that you would think that you have access to the same information, but to believe that you could live in a country where that much censorship is possible. It's scary to think about, not just for their sake, but to think about, could that be happening in other countries? Or could that eventually happen here? But
one of the things we learned about the Soviet Union was that the role of rumors and people were faced with the sort of lack of credibility from official sources. And so you're right, there was sometimes people would be, believe the narrative, and others would find it convenient to believe the narrative. But there was a also significant undercurrent that was fairly cynical about public sources for precisely the reason that they had a tendency to kind of not make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that both can be true. This is a sort of a case of doublethink that you see throughout China. Is everybody sort of, there's this tendency to sort of not really believe what they're hearing from the official media, but at the same time to get very angry when somebody from the West sort of says, I remember this significant. I remember this when I was living in China, and I one day commented that China Daily, which was the paper for, it's in English and it's sort of there for expats and sort of there for the world or whatever, and it's been there for a long time. And I said, they said, you're reading China Daily, Ethan, sort of like, how nice. I was working at this Chinese TV station, Beijing TV. And I said, yeah, well, I said, I learned a lot from it. And they said, well, how do you mean? I said, well, basically I turn every headline upside down and I get the real story. Okay, so which was true. I mean, at the time they were reporting that piracy in the South China Sea was now under control, which meant that piracy was wildly out of control and they didn't know what to do about it. Okay. Sometimes it was a little more coded than that. They'd go on about biological warfare, the Japanese biological warfare program, sort of out of the blue. That meant that that China was working on a serious biological warfare program. Okay, it was committing more resources to it. I mean, this thing is very easy to read this stuff after a while. But one of my coworkers got very, very upset with me. I mean, he was really, really mad and offended, and I can understand that. I mean, I'm a bit of a patriot myself, so I don't like people slamming America. Or I used to be a New Yorker, so I hate it when people say New York is a bunch of trash or something. And so I get it, but at the same time, I was expressing this with reasonably good humor. Okay, and he just was flying off the handle. And this was a very smart guy. I mean, who thought of himself as kind of avant-garde and a sort of artist, and somebody appreciated the more sophisticated things in modern young people's lives, right? If you follow.
It's interesting to see how they're reporting the developments in the last couple of weeks, because we've, in short, had almost a kind of a slow-moving earthquake, as there is such a thing happening in the real estate market, and kind of take you through the various steps. To even this week in particular, we're kind of, you read closely that. So at the end of September, Evergrande, which is the sort of largest or one of the largest real estate developers, defaulted. And again, I think I could tell you what the China Daily story is, because we would see that everything is under control. That this particular company made lots of mistakes and had expanded and overextended and what have you. And so don't worry, everything's under control. And that said, within about a matter of days, so sort of within 2 weeks after that, you had several other companies also default. So it isn't just Evergrande. It's I think China Properties and Sync Holdings also defaulted, and there seem to be more possibilities. There's been a lot of downgrades in the company. But I think Fantasia or Fantasy was one of the other companies. So we've now had a series of these very large companies. Today, the Wall Street Journal reported that in the majority of the cities in August, real estate prices had dropped. So even before Evergrande defaulted, you saw a turn in real estate prices. And fascinating too, and I'll stop with this one. The Journal reported this week that he was running into resistance on the part, political resistance, to putting in what would essentially be a property tax for the local government. So right now you have this model where the local governments depend on seizing land or getting land and selling it to developers, and this provides, I think, somewhere in a quarter to a half or say a third of their local revenues, that they're running into. The idea for a long time has been, well, then if they began to tax it, they would have a recurring income source, as opposed to having to constantly be building houses in order to get revenues. The resistance apparently was coming from, I gather, within the Chinese Communist Party, because many of those members own lots of homes and were not keen to pay taxes and were worried that they wouldn't be able to pay it in retirement. So again, what began literally less than a month ago with a single default, you now have a sort of cascade, and again, some of the news was before the default, of sort of a slow unwinding crisis, a little like what we have. It's incredibly important because by some statistics, a quarter to a third of the Chinese economy is dependent upon this construction industry. And were there to be a halt, and by some figures, there's I should stop there, but tens of millions of unoccupied apartments, were that to stop, it would really have a huge impact on China.
I think we've all seen the pictures of those entire cities, really, that were built, and nobody's occupying them and so forth. I think of them as the Brasilia cities, although Brasilia is now occupied, apparently, the capital of Brazil. But certainly that's true. But I think the Communist Party actually made a kind of a wise decision in this case, not to allow that kind of taxation. And here's why. I've worked in Chinese companies. The first thing you do is just declare that you're nothing but losses. Okay. Everything you do, every time you get a profit, you declare it as a loss. Okay. You just you just take the plus and turn it into a minus sign. And if you were to do that on a national level, you really would see a collapse. Okay. Even if it wasn't true, you would see that kind of collapse because everybody would protect themselves from trying to pay any taxes. They will all do this, even though it's risky to do it. All companies do it. Okay, unless they're very, very well-known companies which constantly deal with the West. So I think that's one problem that they have, is that it's impossible to get a true revenue stream going here, and this is probably the wrong time to do it. if what you're describing, and it sounds like that it's fairly clear that it is the bubble bursting, but they're trying to control they put that into a slow motion collapse somehow. Now, there is another factor here, though. You mentioned that a lot of the Chinese Communist Party officials have housing in China, and they certainly do. But you go back, you'll remember this for sure. I think about 15 or 20 years ago, they were all buying in America, in very odd places. They were buying in Michigan. They were buying in parts of Texas that nobody invests in. The truth is, they've done that not just in America, and they buy sort of standard middle-class homes. But they've actually done it. I've seen them in entire cities that they built in Hungary and Romania. I've seen these with my own eyes. They're bizarre cities. They're not occupied. Now, this is, my assumption has always been, and I could be wrong about this, but this is a way to just move capital outside of the country. Okay. So that's, I think, one of the big fears is that at some point, this is like why do birds fly south for the winter? What is the signal? We don't exactly know, but there may be a point, and it may happen very quickly when suddenly abandon ship, right? And you go back to these assets. Now, they're not huge assets. They're not enormous. As I say, they're middle-class homes, but they're worth something. They can be sold for something, right? And they have created these little nest eggs all over the world. And they're most of the time, they're not very flashy nest eggs, but they're there. And so we will see that, or could. And I think that's one of the key things that we should be watching out for here.
So
because at the top level, they're going to, when they start to move, we don't need to be watching China right now. We need to be watching these places, these homes. I forget some of the other regions that they're in, but you might remember. I mean, it was a very odd phenomenon at the time that they were picking the sort of least glamorous places in the United States to invest in.
Well, some
no
of
offense to people who live in Michigan or the weird parts of
sure, but clearly,
I'm from Michigan.
Canada.
I'm from Michigan. I apologize to my home state.
And I'm not sure I'd describe this as being a backwater places, but in Vancouver and Toronto, it's actually become a huge Canadian political issue as the price of real estate has gone up. And part of it is in international purchases, primarily from China, coming in to buy up condos.
Well, this was specifically the group that was buying these housing in these out-of-the-way places. Again, obviously Michigan's a central and very important state, but certain parts of it are not so important and maybe not so wealthy or interesting. And, when we look at that, these were princelings. These were sons and daughters of top Chinese officials who'd been dragged through the mud in the Maoist era, right? They've been practically, strapped behind a car and dragged, a couple of miles. Experiences like that. I mean, some of them lost their testicles, for example, in the Great Leap Forward and so forth. So you have to keep in mind they have a built-in sense of how dangerous this kind of stuff can be that perhaps some of the nouveau riche in China do not. And some of the, dot-com billionaires and that kind of thing don't have that feeling. And they're the ones, I think, in Vancouver. They're the ones in Toronto and so forth. Yeah. But I would watch the Princelings. They know what's going on.
Well,
Jack Ma does not know what's going on, really.
This is kind of sparking a memory in my head because I'm just I hadn't even thought about this and if there is some kind of connection, but I graduated undergrad in 2019. But there were a lot of Chinese, and I mean native to China, not just Chinese Americans, but Chinese students at my university. And I went to George Washington University, which is centrally located in DC and has a lot of, I would say, higher than average income parents. Is there some kind of connection there? Maybe not directly to people buying up housing in the US, but to maybe these people looking out for their children and wanting them to have opportunities open up in the US to get out of China?
Oh, yes. No, I definitely think this is the insurance policy. It always has been. There's no question about that. And the whole business with them all going to British private schools, right, boarding schools and so forth, that's all real. I mean, that's all true. No. Admittedly, they weren't the inventors of that idea. Hong Kong, top people from Hong Kong have been sending their boys to my son went to I can't help but brag, but he went to Winchester, right? Winchester College. It's one of the top schools. It's a great school, wonderful place. Most of the people he was around were from Hong Kong, right? They're very bright. They work really hard. They get in. They do very well. Okay. Some of them were from Beijing, right? He asked one of his friends, came in and he said, "What's your favorite kind of music?" And he said, "National anthems." So sort of gives you a feeling.
I mean, we have
cultural
a friend,
gap.
we got a friend in the Maryland GOP named Garrett Zaner, and I feel like that would also be his answer.
No, okay, that's fine. Those two, I could introduce the two of them if you like.
We'll see if Garrett's watching. No, but what is interesting and is you put your finger on obviously these investment patterns is that many Chinese have had a kind of a nest egg that was outside the country. That's been a very common phenomena. I hadn't realized that about, I think the term is right, am I right? Princelings of the Communist Party. Right. I hadn't realized that they were as targeted as that, but it certainly does make sense. And it also makes sense in being a little out of the way, so it's not quite so visible because they're sensitive to what that could mean. So
that's right. That's ergo Hungary and Romania, because who reports things about Hungary and Romania, right?
Right.
But I've actually driven through one of these towns, and it's nothing but Chinese buildings, and they're actually made to look somewhat Chinese. They're quite remarkable, and nobody's in them. Okay. Now they're still active because there's lights and there's obviously some sort of guard systems in place.
Right.
They're just waiting. And so what I'm getting at is that China's been preparing for this for a long time, at least on the top levels. Okay, they've been aware of this. Now, Gordon Chang may have written his book, The Coming Collapse of China, when? 1997? Something like that? Okay.
Yeah. Unfortunately for him, yes.
Oh, so he jumped the gun a little, okay?
Yeah,
but
right.
Okay, but they've been looking at that too for a long time. But it may be somewhat of a different way than he wrote it. But they've clearly been thinking about this. Now, having said that, I opened by saying there is no people that are more entrepreneurial than the Chinese. There are no people that can find ways to make money in disaster like the Chinese. I mean, you even saw this during COVID, okay? I mean, that was a catastrophe, especially for Wuhan. But, the guys who were selling the funeral urns, they went right at it. And the organ harvest, the hospitals which are doing organ harvesting, right back there in February, they announced the first one. I think it's February, maybe it was March. They announced the first double lung transplant because obviously if you had COVID in your lungs, you need to get rid of those lungs, get some new ones, right? And so two hospitals competed and the same day came out and said, we did a double lung transplant, okay? These people are COVID-free now. And, it was amazing. And, people will pay big money for that kind of thing, right? And they were also really saying to the world, we're open for business. Don't think that because, Chinese hospitals, where we've got this COVID thing going on, that you can't come over here and get a new kidney or a liver or a heart. You can, right? So these are people who know how to make money, okay, in a crisis. And so I wouldn't completely count them out in that sense. I think the psychology of China is a little different that way. Where I think as Western society, we're in a funny way, we're actually more collective. We all sort of feed off each other's depression. We say, oh, everything's going to hell. Nobody can hire anybody right now. And that just lasts for a long time. In China, it may be a little different. There's always somebody willing to exploit these things. So
we know that China's ultimate goal, money and power, right? But they want to become the world's economic leader. And one of the big hot and button issues right now in the US is the economy. We see, I just read a poll right before this, 73% of Americans believe that Biden is failing when it comes to the economy. Our inflation is way up. What does that signal for China? Are they looking to, like you said, that they are opportunists? Are they looking at that and saying this is our chance, or are they saying this is just another inflationary period, it'll go away?
I don't know. I'm very worried about this. I actually do lose sleep over this particular question. because my great fear is that they're going to move on Taiwan following the Afghanistan disaster. And I pray that they will read, something about JFK and how he failed miserably in the Bay of Pigs, and then, as far as I'm concerned, overreacted in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, I say this from the perspective of somebody who actually studied nuclear weapons and nuclear war for many years. To me, these were crazy risks over something where you knew the Soviets were going to be perched, have a submarine which could do the same thing, perched, a couple hundred miles from New York, in a short order. And yet you were willing to bring it to that kind of crisis. Well, we don't have to get into that. I'm sorry to bring it up that way, but you can see that clearly the Kennedy administration wanted to react very strongly after the humiliation of the Bay of Pigs. And so I'm hoping they'll look at it that way and say, okay, well, Biden is not in control, or he doesn't know what he's doing, but maybe he'll overreact if we go into Taiwan.
But the other approach is if we're seeing, how shall I say, the Gordon Chang thesis, so give him credit, unfold in real estate. There's also a temptation to use to rally the native nationalism around a political crisis of unifying China. So
so that's the New York Times theory of war, right? Is that governments unify.
I should resent that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I know you mean it well, but it just.
I do mean it well, because the New York Times theory of war is right. It's just never right for America. That's the problem. The New York Times theory of war always uses it to say, oh, well, Bush is going to war just to unify the country. It's like, of course it's not going to unify the country, okay? Right. This isn't going to work at all. And Vietnam wasn't going to unify the country, or any of these wars. That's not really how it works. It is how it works in authoritarian or totalitarian states. The New York Times theory is correct. The problem is they never apply it towards that. They always apply it towards us. Okay, so what I'm saying.
I won't take exception now.
But Mark, I think if I recall correctly, shortly after the events in Afghanistan took place, I think we were talking about this maybe with Reed or another one of our guests on what are the perspectives of both China and Russia following Afghanistan, right? Because like you said, I think that we came to the same conclusion. The fear after Afghanistan is China going to make a play on Taiwan? Right. And I think that, again, I think that's a very real fear for a lot of people. And coupled that with the, perception, and sometimes perception is reality. None of us can know for sure that Biden is quote unquote owned by the Chinese. They might think if China had some kind of intelligence on Biden that we don't, maybe he wouldn't do anything at all. And at least that's what keeps me up at night.
It particularly keeps me up at night because I'm willing to say on this show, I'm moving to Taiwan for 6 months. As soon as they open up their borders. This is already something I set up. I have to do some final research there and then finish a book. Now, what a last chapter that would make, huh? Now, so that's how I sort of console myself. I say, well, if they do invade, it'll make an incredible last chapter. I can write it clinging onto a piece of wood as I sail away. I don't know, with a microchip in my teeth. I mean, I don't know how this is going to play out. I really don't. I mean, to me, I'm surprised that Xi Jinping has gotten as far as he has. I would have thought that there would have been a kind of a little mini revolt, a quiet coup, where they would have said, we're going to a troika, we're going to have 3 people, and one of them's going to take all the heat for all the frustrations. One of them's going to be the big leader, and one of them's going to be the supposed progressive or visionary or whatever. This is always the way they structure it. And it is a fairly stable structure, right? It's not perfect, but Hu Jintao lived under that. Jiang Zemin lived under that, okay? Even Deng Xiaoping lived under those rules. And this Xi Jinping is, he is not doing well, okay? The COVID thing was a disaster. The Belt and Road Initiative is not financially healthy, okay? Not long-term. It's very much a Soviet model. It's go into countries that are kind of basket cases economically, spend a lot of money and then hope something's going to break your way. I don't think so. Look, so when I look at it, I mean, I don't see him as a big success. but he seems to have, he seems to have everybody under his wing. Maybe that's wrong. But what my fear is exactly what was just expressed, that he will use this in the New York Times theory of war to unify the nation, get rid of his enemies, and turn it all towards Taiwan, towards war. That is absolutely something that keeps me up at night. It really, really does. And it's going to keep me up at night if we have a lot of planes flying overhead in Taipei. Okay, physically do that.
Literally keep you up at night, right?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So I don't have answers for those things. I don't know which way this would go, but I've been waiting for that moment for a while, thinking they've got to come back to some kind of rationality here. This isn't working. The Maoist propaganda is not really working. The attack on Tibet and on Xinjiang, East Turkestan, on the Uyghurs. This has been not a good thing. It has not worked out well for them.
Well, we also
their plans to rescue the world through their buying up all the PCP assets and then reselling them to everybody and coming up with a great vaccine that everybody want to take. That hasn't worked out very well. 50% effectiveness isn't really what anybody wants anymore. Maybe some parts of the third world want their vaccine. Nobody else does. I mean, show me the success here, because I'm not seeing it. But internally successful internally in terms of suppressing dissent in China, it seems very successful. In Hong Kong, I mean, it seems to me would hurt their economy over time, and you won't see it immediately, the effect immediately, but you will over time. And I don't know, you're right, they can build all this construction, but if the construction market falls apart, you're going to have to come back to something like foreign investment, right? How do you get it now? Where do you get it from?
And by some accounts, we talked about the empty buildings, and I think to at least a Barron's article, I think about 7 or 8 years ago, that you thought, well, now it just literally 2 weeks from now it's got to collapse, and obviously it didn't. But right now, by some accounts, between unsold and unoccupied, we're talking about around 100 million dwellings, with enough basically to house the United States, right? Roughly 300 million people. Now, a lot of it was for investment. I mean, rather than put your money in the bank, you bought an apartment and you couldn't rent it out, but you sat on it and it was there. A reversal of that business model would, let me add it, $50 trillion. So basically all the wealth of all these Chinese disproportionately is vested in these homes. It seems like a very challenging moment, but we've sort of watched this happen over a longer period of time. And as you mentioned about Gordon Chang in '97, I mean, it's been predicted for about a generation, and up to this point has not happened.
No, well, that used to happen to me with Falun Gong quite often. I was writing my book, The Slaughter, which was largely, though it begins with the Uyghurs, and the first chapter is actually about organ harvesting of the Uyghurs. Most of it's about Falun Gong and a little bit about the Tibetans. And they were like, Ethan, you've really got to finish that book up now. And I'm like, why? I'm a slow writer. What's your problem? And they said, because Hu Jintao's coming into power and he's going to end the persecution. And I was like, really? What source is this? And they're just like, look, we know, we're in touch with it. We've got our finger on the pulse. And Hu Jintao came in and it was business as usual. And, and then they said the same thing about Xi Jinping. He's going to end the persecution. It didn't happen either. So, I mean, I see most of the time you can bet on continuity. You may be right. I mean, the property thing may be pretty big. But then we thought that the SOEs were the state-owned enterprises were going bad. That was Gordon Chang's whole point. He said, look, there are these huge state-owned enterprises. They're being propped up. There's no way the banking system can survive under these conditions. It did. It muddled through, right? The SOEs are still around. Now, I always claimed the one thing that Gordon got wrong was that he wasn't on the ground during that period. And basically, the state-owned enterprises would get this money, all this free money, and then they'd invest it with little, .com entrepreneurs and all kinds of crazy schemes that made money, right? So they were able to make money through another way. And it was just a way of supporting a certain class that was very important for the Communist Party's survival. And that's it. I mean, that I understood that mechanism. I'm not sure you can do that in property. I don't know if it's fungible that way.
Well,
it probably isn't.
Well, you put your finger on a great point, which is that up to now, if you were going to bet on China, betting on continuity or things continuing on as they have in recent past was probably a sure bet, and that would be sort of a question as to see whether or not we're yet about to see a reversal of that.
Well, so we are coming up on the end of the show. Ethan, thank you so much for filling in. I know this was last minute, but I think we got a really good conversation out of it, as usual. It's great having you on.
You can call me anytime.
One day, if we ever go back to doing this live, we'll have to have you come in live. But yeah, so thank you.
I'm going to be down in your neighborhood in a week. So.
Oh, hey, we'll have to get lunch. Well, thank you for coming on, Ethan. Mark, as usual, thank you so much for co-hosting with me. No thanks to Dwight's horrible internet connection in Florida. Ron DeSantis, if you're listening, get better internet wherever Dwight is. And thank you, everybody, for watching. We will be back next week. Actually, we may be back this Friday with a special episode, baby, live from Rocky Gap at the Maryland GOP State Party Convention. Stay tuned for some potential information for that. But otherwise, have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Ethan.
Thank you. Cheers.